begin by reading the woes. Actually, woes 2 through 7, since we discussed woe 1 last week.
That's right. We're into woes. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, then we'll get through a lot more than one woe. So that's good. We don't have to drag out the woes so that we all feel very, very, very woeful.
All the way through Advent, right?
Right.
What chapter is that?
Matthew chapter 23, verse, starting at verse 15.
15. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you see and laugh to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift, the altar that makes the gift sacred? So he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of extortion and rapacity. You blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and of the plate, that the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but within are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves, sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. Serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from town to town. But on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all will come upon this generation. So, a pronouncement. So, the second woe, we talked about the first woe, that you shut the kingdom of heaven against you, neither enter yourselves nor allow those would go in to enter. So the basic problem is that they had excluded God and didn't know God. So they occupied the chair of Moses, which gave them parent authority, but they were inept, incompetent occupants of the chair of Moses. So instead of teaching love of neighbor, love of God, they taught something else which had nothing to do with God. It did have to do with simply following laws remotely. So, second woe, Jesus really continues that. So the Israelites, the mission of the Israelites as the people of God was to spread knowledge of God. But an underlying problem is that if you don't know God, it's very difficult to spread knowledge of God. And since Jesus considers them to be idolatrous, not so much in that they worshiped other gods, but that they had constructed for themselves an image of God, a false one and an inaccurate one, given possible to display the image of God to the world when you yourself don't know what God looks like. So as a result, that mission, the requirement that God's people make God known to the world and bring all to worship at God's holy temple, becomes compromised. It's actually, Acts mentions proselytism a good deal, but it's actually not very clear how common proselytism was in the Holy Land. It's the generally the general sense is that proselytization occurred most readily outside of the Holy Land among Jews, diaspora. But it's also true that there's, in Greek and Latin literature, there's evidence of a good deal of anti-Semitism, which suggests strong resistance to Jewish culture and Jewish religion. But it's still probably true that Jesus, rather that proselytism is more common in the diaspora than the Holy Land. So it may be that Jesus talks about if you make a single proselyte, which could suggest that there aren't very many of them, but at the same time, has anyone ever noticed?
What is a proselyte?
It's a
Convert.
convert to Judaism. And the same, you could, someone converting to Catholicism could also be called a proselyte. And there's a common phenomenon about proselytes often, that they're very zealous. Has anyone sort of noticed that? Many, particularly evangelical converts to Catholicism, tend to support or prefer is a weak word, insist on the Latin Mass, generally don't feel very comfortable with the reforms of Vatican II, see themselves as upholders of traditional Catholicism, and they tend to do it in a very zealous way, far more so than many of the last partisans. In evangelicalism, you also see that a lot, that converts become, the most fervent and the most ardent and the most passionate opponents of the faith. That's a common phenomenon, and it kind of sounds as if it's a common phenomenon among proselytes in Jesus' day as well, since that's exactly what he's talking about. So this is in some ways a continuation of the first woe, only it's in some ways more significant, because the real mission of isn't to themselves be holy or themselves worship God. In some ways, that that's all that they do, that's already a failure, because the real litmus test is how well knowledge of the Lord is spread to the ends of the earth. And so if so implicitly with the single proselyte, they don't do that in very great number. But the condemnation is that when they do it, they carbon copy of themselves, only one who's still more zealous. And since they themselves don't know God and present a false image of God, that proselyte has a equally false but more militant and more zealous image that is not the image of God. So it becomes, so if the mission is to bring people of knowledge to the knowledge of God, this is really a critique about an anti-mission, right? I mean, it's kind of like, when you meet the guy on the street corner who wants to tell you about Jesus, right? I mean, he's going to tell you, about, he's going to force a bunch of stuff that you don't want to hear and that's mostly absurd on you. And unless you're a person of faith, the experience is, one of what is one best of cases that's unpleasant, and one that in the worst of cases is offensive, aggressive, and insulting. And so that's what Jesus is, I think, talking about here. So the mission is turned into an anti-mission, that is bringing people to the knowledge of God. You drive people away from God. Now you're zealous about spreading the knowledge of God who you don't know. And so as a result, he says that they've become twice as much a child of hell. Child of hell is a Semitic idiom for one who's destined for Gehenna. So Gehenna is a name for the valley of Hinnom, which is the site of human offerings to Molech, the idol of the Ammonites. So we can read about it in 2 Kings. chapter 23, verse 10, starting in verse 9. However, the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brethren. And he defied Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. These are the actions of the king who is attempting to root out idolatry. So, of Hinnom or Gehenna is a place of burnt offerings, of human sacrifice. So it later becomes Jerusalem's garbage dump. So, and dumps be places where stuff is always set on fire, and as a result, Gehenna, the garbage dump outside Jerusalem, is always on fire. So it becomes a symbol for hell, and hence we have the notion that hell is a place of fire. So in Jewish tradition, it became the place of the last judgment, and so of Hana are children destined for hell. So there's an irony here that they enormous effort to make a single convert, and then that convert is shut out of the kingdom, just like they are.
Mhm.
So they create duplicates of themselves, only worse. So the first and the second ones are sort of general condemnations, very sweeping ones in some ways. After the first one and the second one would think that they're not much less condemned, since you've completely condemned the faith of the scribes and Pharisees, who have fundamentally been condemned of not knowing God and therefore not being able to worship God, and then condemned of conveying a false image of God, which takes everyone out of the kingdom of God, which is at hand and is all around us. So now we move to the specific, which concerns interpretation of the law and integrity. So the third woe is, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by the temple. So this is about oath taking.
The next one follows along with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The flow is about tithing. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had argued against the taking of oaths at all. It's chapter 5.
Of Matthew?
Uh-huh. Verses 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that it was to the men of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. So one of the line of arguments about this, the third woe, is that this contradicts Jesus' earlier statement in the Sermon on the Mount. Is that true?
No, because he's not saying that this is the right thing to do. He's saying it's wrong.
He's referring to, I mean, here he's speaking about, he's critiquing a practice,
Mm-hmm.
which, right or wrong, is a practice which he feels critical. In the Sermon on the Mount, he's saying to not take oaths, to not swear by something, and especially not to swear, well, he says not to swear by God or anything related to God, and not to swear by your hair or your head, because
Mm-hmm.
none of those things are under your control. What is under control is whether you tell a lie or don't tell a lie.
Mhm.
So simply tell the truth, and an oath is unnecessary.
So he's really saying the same thing. Well, he's using the same idea of an oath as, something that was their practice, but shouldn't be
Mhm.
done. And especially they're bound by an oath on the wrong thing, not the temple, but the gold of the temple, and not the altar, but the gift on the altar. Where the temple and the altar should be more sacred.
Right. So here the motivation is that if you swear by the correct, you can avoid, you can get out of the oath. So it's like the equivalent of having your fingers crossed when you promise to do something, right? If you do it the right way, you can weasel out of it, and it's not a lie because you had your fingers crossed, even though it's behind your back and nobody can see it. There's a good deal of it's in practice. It's not actually completely clear what Jesus is referring to or what the practice meant. So, um, so sort of as a background, um, you know, binding oaths were made not by contracts but by agreements. So, in our the modern world, this corresponds to people who make business decisions or agreements based on handshakes versus those who do them based on formal contracts. So in doing orally, you want to make some sort of vow to indicate your seriousness, right? And so the most common thing to do for pagans is to invoke God's name. So I swear, I'll do this. But for Jews, that's blasphemous. You can't use the name of the Lord. So you have to find.
So by saying God is my witness, that's blaspheming.
I think it is. Yeah.
Or I swear to God.
Yeah. Yeah. That's bit over the top. So remember Matthew, although there are a couple of instances in which Matthew uses kingdom of God, he generally refrains from kingdom of God and uses kingdom of heaven because Jews typically don't use the name of God. And remember, Yahweh is abbreviated. So
So
that
simple
means,
yes or no answer is all we're supposed to say. Wow.
so if you want to swear by something, then you want to do it by some, some thing related to God that isn't God and doesn't, require blasphemy.
But then they won't know how serious you are. I mean, you wouldn't want to lie. You're
Well,
not lying if you're saying that God is your witness.
so you want to swear that if it's going to be blasphemous. So the
Yeah.
implication, if you say, as God is my witness, then you're blaspheming God who isn't your witness. And so therefore you're
But he is
obviously
our witness. I mean, he knows what we mean. And if you
right, but
aren't
if
lying, you wouldn't dare say that.
right, but if you commit an act of blasphemy to assert the truth of what you're saying,
Yeah.
then what you're saying can't be true.
Why?
Well, let's transpose it to
Never
let's
mind. I can't
transpose
argue
it
this.
let's transpose it to our society, which has a different standard of blasphemy. If I say, take a crucifix, light it on fire, and say, I swear by of Jesus that I'll do this, what am I saying?
You're crucifying Jesus.
Again.
You're burning the cross.
I'm committing certainly an
That's
act of,
terrible.
yes, that's the point.
That's awful. But if you're telling the truth and you want to use God as your witness, because
The point is that you're looking at it from a modern point of view, as God is my witness.
okay.
But that's not, but as God is my witness is a phrase that should never be used for a Jew because it takes God's name in vain. It's blasphemous.
The Jews did not use the word God, the name God.
Right. That's true. That's true.
So yeah, so it's blasphemous, and the blasphemer is inherently not to be trusted. So like counter oath, it's almost like saying, I'm not going to do this. So you can't use God's name. So if you want to indicate the seriousness of your oath, then you by swearing not on God or God's name, but on some sacred thing. So that's the origin of this whole way of swearing, that you swear on objects associated with God to uh, avoid saying the name of God.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, in fact, there's an entire book of the Mishnah that's concerned with binding and non-binding oaths. It's called Mishnah Nadarim. So, um, so what Jesus is talking about then is that there's a system of swearing in which the thing you swear becomes non-binding, whereas swearing by something else is binding. So you swear by something that's non-binding so you can weasel out of it if it's convenient to you. In fact, in a vow by the Torah is not binding. A vow by its contents is. He who says Jerusalem has said nothing. So if you swear by Jerusalem, then not binding. And avoid judgment if the oath is broken, if you swear um, properly.
Well, you shouldn't swear in the first place.
That's Jesus' point exactly. Let your yes be yes and your no be no.
There you go. There you go.
So Jesus' point is that it's the temple that makes things holy, and ultimately it's God that makes things holy. So using these small distinctions between what's in the temple and the temple is foolish because they're all holy because God has made them holy. And in some ways, I mean, you can ultimately to all of creation that everything in creation is holy because God has made it holy. So it's inappropriate to swear by any of it. Certainly inappropriate to swear by it in a way to evade responsibility, to evade the truth, and to not intend to you said to do. And implicitly, you're going to swear to God or anything related to God, even though you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. It requires that you keep your word. But speaking something also requires that you keep your word. So why is this blind?
Blind, I think in this case means they're not seeing the fallacy of what they're doing. They're guiding others in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. We have blind guides, blind fools, blind men.
I think he's just pointing out that they're not seeing the bigger picture.
Mhm. They're blind, I think, in a couple of ways. One, their focus is on themselves, right? How can I out of this? So they're unable to their neighbor, the person to whom they're, lying, and they're certainly unable to see God, who makes the holy object that they're appealing to weasel out of. And their vision is fundamentally, sort of diverted. So they're focusing on the near object, the gold in the temple or the gift on the altar, and they're not seeing the altar and the temple, and they're not seeing beyond that God. So they're blind. They're not seeing. They're seeing, sort of through a tiny little hole,
Mhm.
missing everything.
Kind of like that speck in your brother's eye instead of the log in your own. Right?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Anyways, it's
Yeah, you're just looking at something small.
missing the obvious, missing what's clearly there through interest and through deception.
Hmm.
So although we don't see, although the issue of oath taking isn't, a very acute one in our day, the blindness is. And I think we frequently see blindness among religious people. It's expressed really in self-righteousness and in condemnation of others, and especially in condemnation, harsh condemnation of others for sins that we ourselves commit. So like the televangelists who, condemned homosexuality and homosexual practices, but were themselves engaged in homosexual acts, or the televangelists who condemned adultery, but were themselves involved in adulterous relationships. So, this tendency to condemn others, focus on their sins, when in fact you're the same or greater, to be very condemning of others, to make it clear that their behavior is, despicable, objectionable, and they're going to hell unless they immediately repent, which of course you have no intention of doing yourself.
So then, okay, so we know that God does not approve of homosexuality, the act of homosexuality. So how would you defend God's point of view on that?
Um,
What is better to say?
well, that's a hard one. God does not approve of homosexuality, but he does give us free.
Right. But if you're
So,
trying to convey that message to somebody without being a hypocrite, just because you're a Christian, you're going to get attacked?
well, for me personally, I, wouldn't raise the issue at all. If
No,
people
but
if people are homosexuals, then they're homosexuals. If people are transgendered, then they're transgendered. From my perspective, God will judge them, but I'm not. I'm perfectly fine with people being homosexual, being transgendered.
So
The issue,
we're not supposed to defend that and say that was something that God doesn't want.
the problem isn't that the problem. I mean, from my experience, isn't that it's something that we need to defend. It's usually something that for us is an attacking point, and it then therefore becomes a need to defend. So when we attack their homosexuality, then
But
they
what if you're
naturally,
in a conversation with somebody? I don't know.
if you're in conversation with somebody, how does, I mean, what did you throw in? God doesn't approve?
well, I mean, I don't know.
I mean, it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to tell somebody what God doesn't approve of unless you have a relationship with them in which you can tell them, you can discuss with them what you think God does and doesn't approve of. Short of that, it becomes simply an attack and an act of condemnation.
Mhm.
So if somebody who you don't have a close relationship comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'm gay," then you tell them about what God thinks about it. That's not appropriate. I mean, it's not, as Christians, responsibility to provide a model and a path, not to tell people what they should be doing. And that's a fundamental problem about Christianity. We think if we can force people to do something, we think if we can make
No,
people make people feel badly enough, if we can put people in a state of guilt or condemnation, then they're going to change their behavior.
that's not the intent. The
No,
intent.
that's not the intent, but that's the practice very frequently. I mean, I think we see the practice just all the time. So, and the world sees the practice all the time. I mean, the whole thing with the televangelists and their enormous sins is, sort of in some sense a good representation, because it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, among, they're, in a lot of ways, I mean, I can think of, sort of rampant cases, less homosexuality, although, that was the problem with some of the televangelists, but rampant adultery among not only the televangelists, but many evangelical pastors. So, that's something, and all people who preach about, the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of the family and whatever. And, it's like, it's hypocrisy. You have no right to talk about the sanctity of marriage when you commit adultery, when you have no right to talk about any of these things when you yourself are the sinner, often, and often by the standards of the world, they're sinful. Their
No, I
behavior
agree with
crosses
that.
the
I agree
behavior.
with that.
Yeah. So and so, we always have to be careful that we be the light, that we reflect the love of God, that we not condemn people, that it's not our responsibility to tell, and nor do we respect God when we tell people how they should be living their lives. We respect God when we recognize the innate dignity of all, not only all people, but all God's creation, all beings. That's what we're called to do. We're called to be a light to the world, very much like Saint Francis was a light to the world, but never to tell people how they should be living their lives. I mean, there's a place for that if you build a relationship with someone where you are called to do that, or there's a place to do that, but not otherwise. Otherwise, it becomes presumptuous, disrespectful, and in some sense, fails to recognize the dignity of the person you're speaking to. What we're really talking about is the of saying something that you don't mean, the practice of saying something so that you can weasel your way out of it.
Mhm.
And here, so it's not even so much that you have a double standard, it's just simply that you have no integrity. You have no integrity and see very far. You're blind. The only thing you can see is yourself. Yourself is just not what it's all about. Yourself is not very important in the ultimate scheme of things. So here again, in some ways, so we've talked about, so the previous two woes, the basic problem is that they don't know who God is, right? So they're doing this stuff and it's all about the law and you have to do this stuff, but God is not involved. God is not active. They don't see God. They have no idea of who God is. And so you can't let somebody into the kingdom of God if you don't know who God is, including themselves. They can't let themselves into the kingdom of God either. So they think they have the keys, but they've locked the door. So here we see a practical application of that. The casuistry of oath taking, where you try to swear so that you can not have to keep the oath, just completely locks out God and is blind. So questions about or other comments about the third woe? We've really moved along. Two woes already.
Actually, the third and the fourth, right?
The next one is very similar.
Yeah.
Mint and dill and cumin, neglecting the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. Those things that are important to God, they're forgetting because they're interested in the cumin, dill, and mint, or other herbs,
Right.
crops.
So herbs. So an important thing about that is related to the zeal of the third woe. Right. I mean, here in the third woe, it's talking about the zeal of the proselytes. But here we have an issue of the zeal of tithing. Right. So they're tithing and cumin, right? But those aren't tithable crops. You don't have on mint, dill, and cumin. Tithing, we don't have to read the scriptures, but tithing on herds and flocks is defined in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 32. Tithing grain defined in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 27, and Deuteronomy 14, verse 22. Tithing wine is defined in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 27. Tithing on oil is defined in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22. So oil is like olive oil or, the oil from whatever plants. And instead of tithing with the products, you have the option of tithing with money if the distance is too far for you to take, your herd or some of your flock. That's based on Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 24 through 26. So the idea of the tithe then is that the tithe sets aside 10% of the tithe. You set aside 10% of the tithable commodity needs of Israelites who have no land. So the tithe is based on the recognition that the promised land is the sole property of God. It's the property of God, and your tithe is sort of what your contribution in recognizing that God has given you, the land or the produce of the land. So that 10% goes to those with no land, there are two categories of people: the poor, and there are the Levites, the only one of the 12 tribes that are not given land because their sole responsibility is to minister to God. So the so herbs and small garden plants are not mentioned in tithing. So the Pharisees have an excess of zeal in tithing, and so it's a sign of their, sort of rigorous devotion. So this is kind of a reflection of Pharisaic practice, and sort of the way in which we talked last week. I think we talked last week. It may have been the week before that, about the Pharisees, sort of extending the law and taking practices that applied to priests and extending them into households, because households were also priestly in some sense. And so the Mishnah also extends this tithing to everything. It says, Mishnah Ma'aser deals with tithing. It says all that which is, so the Mishnah is from the 2nd century, so it's somewhat later, but so some of these practices probably, developed a bit later, but some were also probably current. In this case, almost certainly in Jesus' time. So all that which is food and is watched over, and its growth is from the soil, is liable to tithes. So that's the principle. So Jesus didn't object to the intensified tithing, although from the Sermon on the Mount, he does object to in order to tithe, right? I mean, so we talked about people were some cases of people being so concerned with being seen as givers that they would drive themselves into poverty by giving too much, right? So their concern wasn't really the alleviation of human need. Their concern was that they be seen as givers. And here we have really the same thing, that the focus is on the giving and not on the recipient of the gift, nor is it on human need, nor is it on really human concerns. It's simply with fulfilling the requirements of the law, forgetting what the law is for. So the irony here is that tithing, besides meeting the needs of the priests or the Levites who have no land, also meets the needs of the poor, and yet they're forgotten about. So they presumably receive the proceeds from the tithes, but that's all. So because of that, they're blind guides.
Mhm. I like the part straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. You could just imagine.
Those are two extremes, that's for sure.
Irony again.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone know why they're straining out a gnat?
You're splitting hairs. They're,
Well, actually, a gnat is unclean.
oh,
So
okay.
they're concerned about. I mean, it's very much so. They're concerned with they're overly zealous, right? So they're concerned about tithing on something that you don't have to tithe about,
Okay.
and so, but they've forgotten that they've forgotten about, particularly implicitly, they've forgotten about the poor. They other than they're focused on the tithing, but not on the poor. So the idea of the tithing is that you want to give to alleviate need, but they've forgotten about the need part. They've only focused on the giving. And so the question then becomes, can I do something more? Or is this being used properly for people in need? Or also, why are people in need?
Mhm.
What's going on that people are needy? Why are there people without land?
It's sort of like the some of the groups that collect money. You have to be sure and check to see, is that money going to people in need or is it going to the group collecting the money?
Mhm.
Mostly, with
Right,
1% going to people in need.
right.
That same, you're always having to watch for that.
Hmm. So, so the net is obviously a tiny little insect, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's clean. So let's define the. Let's take a look at Leviticus chapter 11.
Mm.
This is 20 to 23. All winged insects that go upon all fours are an abomination to you. Yet among the winged insects that go on all fours, those which have legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. I think you can eat locusts and grasshoppers,
Hmm.
which, if made properly, with the proper seasonings,
Or if
are
it's
I'm sure
probably
are
big.
I'm sure still pretty gross. Of them, here it is. Of them, you may eat the locust according to its kind, the bold locust according to its kind, the cricket according to its kind, and the grasshopper according to its kind. but all other winged insects which have 4 feet are an abomination to you. And also,
Are the spiders in here too, or not?
no, spiders aren't insects. Well, spiders are, does anyone know what spiders are?
Arachnids.
Arachnid, yeah.
Yeah, but then they're a part of a more general category of creature, but not insects.
Not
Yeah.
insects.
Not
Really?
insects, yeah. Yeah, spiders. Remember whenever we were talking about spiders last, I think when we were talking about our previous Laudato Si class, I kept trying to qualify spiders with whatever they are. It's because they're not insects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'm just not sure what they are. And then also verses 41 through 44. Every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth is an abomination. It shall not be eaten. 43, you shall not make yourselves abominable with any swarming thing that swarms, and you shall not defile yourselves with them, lest you become unclean. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls upon the earth. So, now the danger, obviously, is that a gnat is going to get into your wine. And incidentally, you're drinking something, Mary. Have you checked for gnats? You've
Yes,
checked
I
for
have
gnats.
had a fear of gnats my whole life.
That's good.
We had gnats in the orchard. We lived in the middle of an orchard. And in the summer,
Yeah.
you go out at dusk, and they would just
Covered with-
swarm around you. And my dad used to always say, "You don't have to worry about gnats." And I said, "Yes, they've got teeth."
And they're unclean.
I didn't know they were unclean when I was 3, but I knew they had teeth.
Well, that's probably why you thought they had teeth,
Yeah.
because they're unclean. So that's good.
Yeah. So whenever even as I was growing up, when the gnats started swarming, he would say, "No, they're okay." And, "Nope, they've got teeth. I know they have teeth."
That's cute.
Yeah, painful teeth.
Yeah, I just couldn't stand that evening.
Did they bite?
Morning.
Do
What?
they bite? Do they bite?
No.
No,
Okay.
But
no.
when they're swarming around your head and you're little, you're sure that there's something evil about them.
Yeah,
And teeth.
and they're annoying.
Yeah, they are. And they get in your nose and your mouth.
Yeah,
And sometimes your eye, if you're not
Yeah.
fast enough closing it.
yeah,
Ooh.
that's
And
true.
your ear.
So the Pharisees strain their wine to make sure there's not a gnat in it, right? Because they don't want to accidentally swallow a gnat because it's unclean. So gnats were considered the smallest of insects. So camels are also unclean. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 4. So camel is the largest of animals in Palestine.
Okay, so chewing cud, isn't that like a cow? You can't eat beef? You shouldn't eat beef?
Well, whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chewed among the animals you may eat.
Oh, you may eat.
Nevertheless,
Okay.
among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. Camels that chew but does not part the hoof is unclean to you. And the rock badger, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the bear, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the swine, because it hoof and is cloven footed but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. So, in
So
any
we
case, the
should,
camel,
so that's why the Jews don't eat pork.
right? Yeah,
So we shouldn't be eating pork.
we're not living under the law. I mean, there are good reasons not to eat pork, but those good reasons to not eat pork
Well,
are really the same
from,
reasons to not eat beef or not eat chicken or not eat meat in general. Uh, but, but so the thing is that this is unclean, the largest animal in Palestine.
wow.
And so they're focused so much on the tithing that they forgot what the tithes are used for. They've forgotten about the poor. They've shut out everything except the tithing. Tithing is really not the point. You know, one should tithe, certainly, but one focuses on the broader issues, not on the minutia of tithing. So once again, they've forgotten. Let's take a look at Micah. We're almost out of time, so we'll take a look at Micah and then stop. It's Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Actually, let's start at verse 6. Page 759 for
Oh, thank you.
those with the DK Bible. With what shall I come before the Lord? Actually, this exactly expresses what Jesus is saying. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So the Pharisees is tithing, which is good, except that in their busyness of tithing, they've forgotten to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. They're not tithing because it affects the poor. They're not tithing out of a sense of compassion. They're not tithing out of love of God. They're tithing because you're supposed to tithe, and that's it. They've forgotten about everything else. So here again, the continuing critique is that God is simply absent from, uh, from their practice of religion. We talked about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, that they're practical atheists. And here you see the practical atheism in this critique. God just isn't present. You don't do anything because of God. God has been lost. He's dropped out of the equation, not part of the picture. So, with that, this is a good place to stop also, to sixth and seventh woes are all closely related, culminating in the accusation of murdering the prophets.